Okay, so welcome back. We're continuing. This is the sort of second last from the penultimate sort of exploration of my first doctorate. This is a rather large chapter compared to some of the others, as you might have guessed, where I've integrated everything. So we're going to go and continue on this with the sort of contrast of Eve, Pandora, temptation, some of the myths, divine providence, uh, divine purpose, uh, how we all fit in, and well, a little bit of economics and game theory because it's me, and for some reason, I feel that I need to chuck them into everything, even theology. I believe that I'm probably the only person who's ever done that. Um, if I'm wrong, then I'm wrong, but I haven't ever read anyone else's things that way. Um, although there is a version of Red Queen theory that is based on Catholic versus Protestant sort of religions, but that's a little bit different once again. So we're going to continue in what we've been talking about in all of this and contrasting our sort of our protagonists and all the rest, remembering that the stories have a lot of similarities, but they have some radical differences as well. And the nature of how Eve and Pandora differ can also be seen as some of the foundational sort of schisms between what Rome was and what it became. In my opinion, Eve was really the foundational difference in many of the cultural sort of changes, not only like Christ and Mary and all the rest, but Eve, of course, being the first woman, embraced and captured some of the differences that basically took Roman society and made it something else. Now, as we all know, Roman society, of course, went from, well, basically a pagan culture into Christian. And as this happened, many of the mythologies and stories of the culture changed significantly as well. So I've gone into quite a deep dive into the concept of women as they, well, basically are seen in different cultures. And as we're looking at that, what we're going to have to do is imagine the distinctions. And let me just bring that up in case someone gets it. Now, um, we have covered the inherent evil. We've covered the other aspects like Augustine would go into with it's a necessary step. But I think part of the thing which we'll get to later as well is going to be information asymmetry. And now there's nothing infinite in our world. This is a concept people don't understand. We're taught in mathematics to make nice, simple little gestures of infinite. There isn't an infinite. There is no such thing as any infinite, which makes lots of mistakes, even in physics, where people love to go into black hole theory and things like this and say infinites exist. They don't. If we think about it, you might be able to take the um, extension in mathematics and at the limit say, when we hit infinite time, this thing will do X. There's a problem with that. We have a limited universe. This universe, while it may live trillions or hundreds of trillions of years, we don't actually know, but either way, that's finite. On the scale of infinite, they're both finite. So, where I'm actually getting to pull this back is if we have an infinite God and a God of infinite knowledge, then it's very simple. If we think about it for a moment, the difference between our finite knowledge and anything that a deity can have is beyond our comprehension. And not just minorly beyond our comprehension, utterly beyond our comprehension. If you can think, imagine how difficult it would be to have all of the knowledge captured in a single city at a point in time. Of course, we have Hayek, Mises, and others talking about these sort of things and the difficulty of sort of centrally controlling systems of government and why markets actually derive information. Now, imagine if all of that could be in one place. That one place would be incomprehensible. Like it or not, that's just going to be the way it is. So we have all of these stories developing through an interpretation of information and knowledge as if we know it, if we can capture it. So this mythology here is always, it must be good, bad, different, because I see this world and this is how I interpret it. But the thing to remember is it wouldn't even be just that scenario. It would be every possible thing going forward. It is the whole issue of what is good, bad, or beyond the theogony problem. Everything is wrapped in Eve, more than people imagine. Now, God, if God has infinite knowledge, something that we can never have in this world, this universe, infinite is beyond any idea of comprehension. Not just minorly, but I'm going to hammer this one home. It is not just I know everything that possibly happens in New York. Every person's thought, every person's dream. None of us will even have a perfect memory of our own lives. That is the past. Now imagine not only having a perfect knowledge of your own life going back, every mistake you've made, every good thing you've done, every twitch, being able to analyze everything, every blink from every angle in infinite time, but going forward as well. So every possible scenario that could occur, you would know every possible feasible outcome that could come not only from that one, but every branch that then builds, every possible ripple. If I drop this coin and then I drop that coin, what happens not only then, but throughout history? So this is part of the problem with the mythology of both Eve and Pandora. We take them in a different way to what a God's eye view would see, because there is no way that we can imagine it. So as we're looking at some of this, I mean, I'm Wesleyan, Uniting Church. So my context, of course, is a little bit, well, a lot aligned with that, as you might have guessed. And in analyzing this, we're going to, of course, have our own frame. As someone who's also studied business and management and about everything else, for those who have done an MBA or something, you'll probably know about looking at things through different frames, trying to imagine how you run an organization, for instance. And in doing that, what we're going to have to remember is every person seeing this is going to contextualize the stories differently. Not just Eve or not just Pandora, but both. So they are a core of our culture, but one that very few of us understand. So this is also something critical to remember. We have very few people understand the nature of the mythology anymore behind the society that we're in. Not just in the current generation, but even mine. The whole reason for stained glass windows, for instance, in early churches was the people didn't read Latin, so the stained glass windows would give stories. So um, we have a gravitas forming, a weight, a sort of depth of understanding around this that changes not only what people see in gender theory today, but the very nature of our roles in society. Now, one way of looking at this, of course, is that we are effectively equal in genders, but we have different roles. Now, that doesn't mean good, bad, or indifferent, and that we should, like some people will say, make everything completely equal and force people into things. No, it's very simple. Different people have different roles. And if you're wanting to go out there and become an engineer or a lawyer, good for you. If you want to stay at home and do something, good for you. But um, apart from a few um, conditions where I think maybe a certain type of man and a certain type of woman where the woman's more powerful than the man, it probably won't work. And it usually doesn't. And that's just part of how this has evolved. Now, this is more than, of course, going into just what society has said. Naturally, we have preconditions, and um, well, we have developed through this an essence of stories that really captures who we are. So we can argue that these stories are basically, well, pretending to be something else, but the reality here is they are part of us. So, as we're going through what I've given you in this, we have quite a number of aspects of art, literature, etc. The theology.
Craig, may I pause you for just 1 second?
Yes.
On that last screen, the artist, who painted that? Do you know?
I'm not actually sure, which I should know, but I don't remember.
Well, I'm curious only because it kind of goes on topic with what we're talking about, where it looks here that the artist sees that, Eve is blaming the serpent, and we can kind of see Adam is blaming Eve. And I just wonder if that artist saw the flaw in man blaming woman, like you're saying here. I mean, any human could take on that, make that error, picking the apple. So I wonder if this artist is...
Well, I actually think it's beyond that. Remember, we've covered the fact that Adam, of course, wasn't himself innocent. He might feign innocence, but he didn't not partake. And going, hey, I mean, Eve, you've done this, I will too. I mean, there are different ways of looking at it. It could be, look, you did it. I didn't stop you. I'm going down with you. I want to be with you. But then he would have had to have gone, look, I did this because I want to be with her and I'm going to suffer the same. But he didn't do that. So.
Right. Okay. Just thought it was interesting.
Yeah, so it's interesting in how the stories have developed. Of course, the old fig leaves that they've got there were post realizing that they're naked. Again,
right.
Some of this actually is also an aspect of sort of existence that we forget about in how we analyze the two stories, Eve and Pandora. Now, remember, the fire from Prometheus wasn't just fire; it was technology and development and things like this. So, if you actually think about it, pre-Prometheus coming down to Pandora, she would have been naked as well. So the the whole Pandora myth would also incorporate all of these sort of emotions going out into the world, including shame.
Well, in general, I notice a lot of the artists portray Adam and Eve as being very adult, but you make a very good point in that they're more like innocent children. And I can't think of many artistic drawings and paintings and whatnot showing them innocent, unless this is to show immediately after the
Even
taking of the apple.
beforehand, I mean, when you look at Eve and the serpent, Eve is voluptuous in most cases. She's
Right.
a young, maybe late teens type woman. Adam's in his early 20s. Um, Spent too much time in the gym, as always. Had
Most
nothing to do
So
but
there,
pump iron.
so there haven't, I don't know, but have there been any portraits or drawings, paintings, whatnot, of portraying them young and innocent, like a child?
There will have been, but generally not so much from sort of like the Renaissance, Baroque, um, anything like that. They're generally later, especially modern.
are most of
So
the
those sort of
artists
things come
sorry
differently in
are,
history.
are most of the artists and most of the authors, are they it's male dominated again, is it, like of the period?
The majority, yes.
Yeah.
There were female painters and there were female individuals in fine arts. It wasn't quite like we seem to think now that women didn't work or any of this stuff. They did. During medieval times, women worked. Like
Be
it or not, you had to. You worked or you died. So,
be interesting to see a female artist perspective of what she would portray of the same scene, kind of thing. So there's not many of them around, really, though.
not back then, no. Um, really comes down to you had to be wealthy and then also outside of being married off. Because if you were wealthy, you were generally in a class that would be married off. So, anyway, um, so one of the bits I'm actually pointing out here is that if you consider the the caricature and how we've taken the two stories, there are a lot of overlaps that have been read differently. So in Pandora, all of these things that escape into the world include shame. So the first time Pandora would have recognized shame was after opening the jar and letting all of the ills or goods or whatever else out. That, in a way, is very analogous with the Eve story. After eating the apple, suddenly we have shame. Yet, when you think about it, in Roman society, no one thought about it. Greek society, no one thought about that aspect. There were other hardships, other problems, other emotional focus, but they were not, well, the core aspect of any of this that people talked about. So the core of what people talked about in Christianity is very different to the core in the pagan religions. And in part, again, this is really some of the change we see happening around the 3rd century in Rome as Christianity started. We see people changing as well. We think about Roman and Greek society, they were very different before Christianity. They were very different in how people thought, what they considered our places in society. So we could argue that if we go to, say, a culture in Afghanistan and we look at people in tribal groups, they're going to be different again. But that's the whole thing. They're a different way of thinking, but not just a small tribe, but a whole global society. So these myths actually changed how people, well, found themselves in society and what role they had. And women in Greco-Roman society, depending on where they were, what stage of life they were, had more or less freedom depending on how much money and other such things. But women were allowed out at times, but not all the time. They were expected, it wasn't that they weren't allowed out, but there were societal expectations, and they were expected to be at home. So we have Eve and Pandora, of course, would, like here, all be, again, not that young. Adam, of course, would be is always buff, but Eve doesn't seem to do much. So going back to old Hesiod, Hesiod really, again, changes some of the culture of the Greek society that he was part of. And we see, well, Athens itself change as these beliefs around the position of both genders of people in society altered. So as we're looking at what's happening, we're seeing a change. First of all, as well, the Pandora myth changes, and then we're seeing another change when we have the Eve myth. Although that was already there in the Judaic societies, it's very different in how it becomes in Christian society, especially when you have the sort of proto woman and Eve being now replaced by Mary. So Mary then becomes this, especially as it's reinterpreted under sort of Nicene Creed, etc., the virgin woman who, despite having multiple children, has never had sex. I always used to cause problems in my Catholic school by pointing that one out. If she's got multiple children and they're not all gods, then yeah, I don't like to go into that one. She's just an eternal virgin who, yeah. Anyway, so neighboring civilizations, we have a lot of sharing. If we think about now, think about interactions on Twitter and social media, writing, language, etc. We share aspects of our lives, our stories, and cultures change. So it might be faster now. We might have a larger range of people we can interact with. But even back then, as people went around and talked to others, interacted, they would share stories. And even when you didn't reject your own sort of culture, you'd sometimes add these into it. You would say, these guys may be not understanding religion according to what I do, but although they don't understand things fully, it seems that they have a different nuance that is very interesting. And people would then add them, especially in the time of oral of traditions. So something people don't realize now, we still have oral translations and traditions going on. Some of the American tribal groups, the Native Americans, well, they still have oral traditions that haven't been copied down. And one of the things that we do notice is they change significantly. So even in 100 years, these can be radically different than they have been. So this is something I did in earlier studies as well of my own to do with Australian Indigenous populations. A lot of the stories, people don't even know the origin, but they become part of the mythology. I mean, something very few people like to talk about in Australia is an example would be the rainbow serpent. The rainbow serpent isn't actually part of traditional culture. It is now, but it was actually introduced well, 100 and something years ago by Christian missionaries who wanted to build some of the story of Christianity into the native culture to try and make proselytizing and being a missionary easier. So, ironically, some of the foundational mythologies of Indigenous Australian culture actually come from Christianity, and other ones come from Islamic culture and other areas where we try and uh, teach people to be more like us, and all we do is we give new mythologies. The same thing happens even if we look at modern tribal groups like gangs. Then they form their own oral culture because they don't write them down. So, Pandora here, she's basically related probably to some of the earlier sort of deities. We find that many times deities themselves become part of the story. They change, they morph into other things. And yeah, well, whether we're looking at this as feminist or anti-feminist or how we consider that, then we have both stories of hope and tragedy. So again, when we're looking at what we represent, we see again young woman, but in some ways probably could be forgiven. How many of us here at say 17 or 18 weren't completely stupid? I mean, we can say that we're not, but fairly much all of us were. Part of being a teenager is being absolutely stupid and not thinking that you are and blaming the rest of the world for not accepting how wonderful you are and how perfect and saying that you don't understand, so that all of us can then, like 20 years later, go bugger.
That reminds me of last time's class where you said that part of making mistakes and getting hurt is also about learning. And I have a son that is 22 months old, and today he got by a cat. I don't know how you say the nails, and I think it hurt him, but at the same time, it's the first time he learned, and I guess as a parent, it's always a bit hurtful, but I mean that's how we learn, right?
Yes, I agree. So it's also interesting going back. Eve and Pandora are both sort of said to be made from the same material, effectively by the gods. The distinction is Eve and Adam, apart from some of the stories of Lilith and things like this, with the mythological try before that got rejected. Well, humanity was multiple in Greek time. So iron is because, well, we're hard, but we have to be because, well, we rust, we don't survive, and life is difficult in this sort of degraded world. Which is also very interesting in that if you think about the Hindu, the Vedic analysis, then that is multiple versions of the world as well. Many of these things started in the same sort of time periods. There was, for some reason, a big explosion, and only way to put it, a development of many sort of religious stories right across the known world, from China right across to Europe. And interestingly enough, each of those stories shares a lot of similarities. So there were trade routes back in this early period. And if we look at the Babylonian myth with their Enki and things like this, there was a flood myth, but even going right over, if we think about the early Chinese stories, there is a story of a flood myth in China as well. Now, some of this, of course, will be, well, what we call race memory, or the story that we've captured from oral stories over the generations before, and in part explaining our own lives. Now, if we think about it for a minute, one of the areas that, well, early humans ended up would be now the Black Sea. There's a good flood myth there. If you're in this area that is wonderfully fertile, but isn't sort of suffering from inundation of water, and then suddenly there's an inundation of water. If you're in the Americas and you've been able to walk across the Bering Strait, which people at one stage could, and that was not super rapid. It wasn't like the original flood myth. It happened over, well, hundreds of years. But imagine every day you come out and there's a foot less land, and it just keeps creeping up. There'll be stories developing over time about all of this. So now, old Pandora there, we can have the concept of a beautiful evil, something many people don't understand, but beautiful evil is, well, an ill that is still aesthetically pleasing, I guess, in a way you could say. I'm sure we've all known people like that, but anyway. So Eve is, well, divine. Pandora represents deception and destruction in some stories, but both of them really embrace this concept of a hierarchical partnership. We have Greek myths portraying women as treacherous. We see that on a lot of pottery. But this also depends on which time. If we go back to the earlier sort of first era of Greece, before a whole lot of volcanic destructions, before the sea people came in, then what we end up with again is a very different sort of, well, idea of what women were. So women in Odyssey, we covered some of that in the past in our earlier lectures quite some time ago. They're both deceitful and treacherous, but also in some cases, if they have a very difficult life, well, think about Penelope. Penelope spent years waiting for her rather wayward husband, who had a bit of a fling with Calypso and a bit of a fling with ... And she's there, well, waiting perfectly and fending off all these guys who are basically competing to ravish her. And of course, old Odysseus comes in and the first thing he does is has to test her. So women in many parts of the society are looked upon as, there can be an ideal, but even then we don't trust them. So we have a number of satires such as Simonides. Well, again, being like many Greek plays, he takes different types of animals and looks at industrious women like bees. They're the ones that praised, but others are ridiculed. We have vain mares, trick monkeys, filthy sows, etc. So some of these satires have come through even in our society now as well. Ironically, I don't know many people who've read Simonides, Not all of his works survive, but those that do, well, yeah, we have all of this has carried across into our culture, and we still find that it's actually a key aspect of our society. So again, acts of temptation and curiosity, they're both there. We have old Pandora there with rather permed hair. But so original sin, humanity falls from divine grace. But again, what is the alternative? What are we if we are just in the garden? I mean, it might be something that some of the greenies want to take us back to, but it's not really a vibrant society. One of the areas that I'm studying on the side in Roman culture that I'm finishing a dissertation on involves the population of Rome, sort of towards the decline of Rome. And contrary to what some people say, I'm actually arguing that the population of Roman society didn't fall. If you think about agriculture, etc., what I am arguing is that the aggregation of people in cities changed. People moved out of the cities, they moved into the agricultural districts. The population of cities fell. So Rome itself reduced. Other people moved out into these rural villages and country areas thinking they could get away from it all. But part of this is then a decline.
So real quick, you're saying that the decline of Rome was not based on population decline, it was based on the population no longer congregating in large groups to work together.
To share information, to teach each other, to be knowledgeable, to talk.
Right.
There's this really,
okay. Well, I was going to say, so now it's a bit different, though. Now we can still stay interconnected using the internet. I do see. You're right. No, you're right, because, for example, we've had issues with different businesses, say insurance, and you want to get in touch with someone, and they say, well, I can't get in touch with the boss. Well, why can't you get in touch with the boss? Don't you work in the same office? No, he works remotely. I got to send him an email. I don't even know if he's working today. I mean, how can people get anything done? So
yes, why businesses want people to come back into the office again.
Right. Well, those who do will be the ones that are the most competitive and succeed.
So while there are things like we're doing now where people can come together and they can talk and we can sort of see each other's face, that to an extent works. I've done this in philosophy classes that I've taken myself in the past. And if people are willing to be engaged and the class isn't too big, it can work. But when we're looking at things like Facebook or Twitter or something like this, they really don't. Sitting there chatting each other isn't the same as actually being engaged.
Right.
Totally. And I don't want to interrupt, but there's this really great YouTube video. It's called Why Cities Exist. I've watched it probably like 10 times. And I'll link it in the things, but it explains that how the wealthiest areas always have the biggest population density, and the poorer ones have, less.
Yes, at least over time. If you look in someone like Bangladesh, of course, the capital there is growing too quickly. And the infrastructure isn't being built fast enough to account for the growing population, which causes a whole lot of growing pains. But equally, there's a lot of wealth in the city that you would never understand is there. The same in places like in India and Mumbai or Hyderabad, and other cities as well. There are some immensely wealthy people in an area that is drastically poor.
And what it explains in this video is that I view it as microchips, right? And let's say that you want to have like the RAM as close to the processor, and there's the highways or the little connecting, you know what I mean? Like if you can get it faster, then it's going to be more efficient. But then there's like the source of the software. I always view the software as the people, or I don't know, I'm gonna mess it up, but it's because I'm too tired, and it's a very vague idea that I've been trying to articulate in my own mind. But
something you'll find is innovation increases in centers. When you have more people together, you have more innovation. You have more ability to do things. Now, technology has opened up the ability to look and find papers and read other people's ideas, even to reach out across the globe and talk to each other. But we still meet, we still have conferences, we still get together. And for those of us who aren't as wealthy, who can't sort of jump on a plane and go around the other side of the earth, then finding people and being in those conferences really requires that things are still closer. So while the elite in society sort of benefit from this immensely, the majority of people still need that sort of proximity.
So it stifles competition. As the elites continue to benefit from everyone leaving the cities, it's harder for the poor people to get together and compete.
Well, in their individual cities, it makes it easier for a lot of poor people to congregate. For rich people, they can get out and still congregate and not worry as much. So information sharing and meeting and exchanging ideas is difficult if you're poor and isolated.
So
if you're
sorry, Craig, I was thinking about the slum cities in Mumbai. Now you've got like they're really industrious, but they are still slum cities. So but they're making like millions and millions within a year within the slum cities. So they can still be industrious but poor next to a richer kind of industrious city within the same sort of geographical area. So is it that, you know, the poorer people would move away from the center of a city, but they would still go and make their own version of a city just on a lesser scale? Would they run away from taxation and things like that, you know, to get away from what was happening within the city?
Well, I don't know if they're getting away from things like taxation, but they're closer to other people so that they can get a multitude of different services. So if you think about somewhere like Mumbai, there are lots of services that anyone can get to. Now, if you're incredibly wealthy, of course, you can have anything you want anywhere on earth. If you're not wealthy, then finding things that fit within your ability to access is more and more difficult unless you have an aggregation of many services.
And sorry to interrupt, but I was thinking about how to solve the homeless problem in Los Angeles, because it got pretty bad during COVID. And but I realized they're always going to congregate, just like, you know, flies to a light to a city, because they can get free clothes and free everything. But if you just ship them out to the desert, which is a thought of mine, then they're just gonna, you know, there's nothing, they're just gonna die in the heat. So it's always gonna
wander back.
yeah. But I do think one solution could be to to create like a penal colony, basically. But I don't know how that happened, because there has to be somebody that organizes some sort of industry and enterprise. But yeah, it's a problem here, but it's getting better.
Okay, so anyway, getting back to our story, Eve and Pandora have both evolved. They were very different at the beginning. People like Thomas Aquinas have changed them again. Calendria and other authors following that have again taken a different view. And there are completely different views in sort of modern and postmodern worlds. Eve and Pandora have both been reinterpreted many times. So one of the interesting things with these stories is you can look at them in different ways. Now, we can use this as a lens to see gender bias. We can use it as a lens to see the story of woman as a temptress. We can see a lot of that in different literature over the years, whether it's Shakespeare, Dostoevsky, etc. And we can also see women as a source of chaos. Also going back to Calypso, who I mentioned earlier, we have this idea of different types of women. So whether we're going to imagine like a satirical version of women who are industrious as bees or sows as an alternative, then the female character can be seen as different. So we can also have a new shift as an anti-feminist fable as well as a feminist fable. So even Pandora teaches that we all make mistakes, regardless of gender, and it's no good blaming the world, blaming women for the world's problems, many of which are just as equally caused by men. And if we think about it for a moment, then a lot of the problem was actually old Adam there. He was just as well deep in everything, but we have a different way of telling it. So it's a personal sort of choice. One of the reasons I became Wesleyan was personal choice, and your own decisions are a critical part of the Wesleyan tradition and how they view the Protestant religion. And as I've said, and as I've gone through these different sessions, the core aspect of this is that I see a journey from innocence to wisdom. Now, this is the heart of what I see in this. We are different as we grow, as we age, as we make mistakes. Now, we can say we've fallen from grace, but who can tell me what grace actually means?
Is it like almost like a state of innocence where or naivety, almost? Like
well, that
sort of
existed, but no, grace is more than that. Grace is like the state you're saved by grace, which is pure choice by God that you have no part of. Not because you're good or evil or anything like that, because God has given you this gift.
It's the grace of God.
It's like when doors are like always open, traffic parts, or like there's that one scene in Ratatouille where the guy's trying to jump over this thing and he's about to not make it, but then the wind blows him over and he makes it. So
it would be the knowing that there's consequences for your actions. So hey, if you do something wrong, but you don't have bad consequences from the outcome of your action while you're saved by grace. Or
so it is the other side of the coin to other stories that I talk about a lot, like modern version being the Invisible Man and various incarnations, but the older version being, of course, Ring of Gyges. And if we think about it for a moment, that's a story of what if we now don't have consequences? And Eve and Pandora, of course, they're divine providence, but they're also a story of consequence. I've done this. What happens? What goes wrong? And it is more, it is, well, one of the areas I don't think people think about is Adam and Eve didn't try and lie to God. I don't know if they're terribly happy being confronted, but they didn't actually lie. They were honest and truthful in saying, "Yep, I ate it."
They wouldn't be able to lie, though, would they?
They could try.
They would
I mean,
already know.
well, he might, but he could go, "No, I didn't do it, God." And God would go, "Look, here's the divine replay. Yeah, there you are.
Here's your evidence.
Sorry, that's you, isn't it? Looks like you, Adam. There's no other humans here." So, yeah, it seems to be. Yeah. So, Pandora was a consequence of sort of actions and a choice, not because necessarily God's intended her to release evils, although that also changes in the later versions where in part they intended it. It was a curse. But it's interesting, some of the Pandora legend changes, the mythology removes the divine plan. Of course, we have that built in to some telling of the Eve story. The allowance of free will, the creation of choice, goes beyond retribution, but it goes into something that, if we think about it properly, if we consider this deeply, then, as I keep saying, it is, we went from that moment of, well, innocence into more. Knowledge comes with a cost, always does. We can say knowledge is power, but knowledge also has cost. It's not free. It doesn't. It's not just given to us with no strings attached. So we have a broad reflection of Pandora in opening the jar. We have lots of versions of Pandora and different aspects of what people wanted to paint, of course, but which gets us back to divine purpose. So we have an omnipotent God, and Eve makes a choice. But then again, everything comes back to having a choice. And all of this comes down to, you could or could not have followed this. But then if you know everything that's going to happen, you must know that it's going to happen. So God allowed Eve to make that choice. Picking on Proverbs 19:21, people make many plans, but it's also the purpose that is already defined, which is an interesting issue in sort of the philosophy of free will, in that if our actions are known, can we have free will? And there are actually ways to argue that even though that you are predestined to do something, you could freely choose to do it.
So would it have been the same outcome if she'd have waited for the fruit to fall and then eaten the fruit from the ground? Would that still have been considered a misdemeanor?
Well, she wasn't allowed to touch that tree at all, so.
But she wouldn't be touching the tree if she let the fruit fall.
Well, still be eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge.
It would still be considered.
Yeah, and well, maybe an alternative would be that Homer Simpson talking pig would come along and eat it, and that's why he could talk. And have smart pigs. All right, so is Eve's disobedience a broader tendency in all humanity? I would actually argue that it is. It's not just woman, it's all of us. So sin may enter the world, but what is sin? What is choice? And sin is a direct sort of component of having free will and choice and making mistakes and being able to fall. Without being able to make mistakes, of course, we're not going to have sin. We're going to be perfectly aligned with everything. But what's the point of that? We may as well be spiders or crickets or snakes or something else. So the nature of humanity can also be seen. This is why I chose Eve and Pandora, because I actually see this as the foundational aspect of what free will is. It is the growth of ourselves, the choosing to be human. Now, there's a interesting cosmology and mythology, a type of theology developed in Frank Herbert, for those who know Dune. The Dune series is actually very interesting in that way. He has taken a lot of different cultures, including and especially Arab culture, seemed to be popular around the time he was writing, and he's integrated that in a very interesting way. But there are a lot of similarities. Now, part of course, the Dune thing was the Bene Gesserits take religions and they use them to mold society. But the other aspect of that is, as they're doing it, the very religions they're trying to control mold them, and they themselves change. And this also happens there. In Dune, one of the arguments is, from the Bene Gesserit would be that we're not all human, that we have to develop into human. That was the test in the first book and the first movie, with the Jabbar, where you answer correctly or die, which is, are you actually human? Can you put aside your animalistic tendencies and be rational, logical, not get rid of emotion, but learn a bit of stoicism and control. And some of this also comes into the story there, where we have whether this is an intrinsic trait that we can grow, whether our curiosity, desire for knowledge is something that we have to have, whether what makes us human. In part, it's language. In part, but isn't that also knowledge? So if we think about we have animals create simple tools, we have all that sort of stuff, but the reality is no animal apart from us has literature. And you might look at some of that literature and go, oh God, that's bad. But the reality here is it's still something we create and nothing else does. As bad as Mills and Boon can be, no ape, no cat, no goat in our picture, no snake will ever create literature.
And can I add in there as well something I've observed as well, that something that no animals also have the ability to do is to pass on stories. So even if humans have no literature, we've been able to pass on stories and knowledge through those stories. And if human from generations to generations were not able to pass on stories for whatever reason, or forgot stories for whatever reason, then there would be a lack of knowledge passed on. And humans, am I right in surmising that?
Yes, but I mean, I would actually say that those stories are a form of literature that is oral, whereas now we have the ability to capture them.
So before they picked the apple, they were just grunting to one another? No language?
Possibly.
It's, yeah.
Maybe God knew their thoughts, but what were they?
So by giving us free will, it gives us, we'll never be omniscient, but it gives us the ability to become more like him. We will never be him, but it's the only tool we have to become more like him, right?
Yes. Yeah. And we can
Yeah.
choose to embrace that. We can choose to learn. We can choose to experience new things, or we can sit there and not.
And just blame Eve.
Yeah.
Yes.
Does the evolution of language, though, as it like evolves, we forget or we unlearn what we learned because we're evolving language so much, so we miss out on things that were recorded down and they need an interpretation?
Yes and no. Language may evolve. I mean, French used to be Latin, Italian used to be Latin, and not everyone spoke the Latin of Cato, but you can still learn these things. In my literature studies, I've done a bit of Old English. I'm absolutely horrible with it, but enough to know that I'm horrible with it, and enough to be able to read and understand Beowulf and a few other early 8th century poems. Equally, I can read and badly translate. I never get the gender in Latin for some reason. Grew up without that sort of culture. I don't with French either. I don't care whether it's a li or a la. It's a goddamn thee. But that's me. I mean,
modern English, old English, there are words in Old English that have completely changed. The meaning has completely changed in the context of modern English.
Well, take the word meek.
Yeah.
I mean, this is one of the ones I love that I've mentioned before. Meek, the meek shall inherit the earth. But now we think of a whole pile of wussy people who do nothing.
But that's not what it meant.
No, meek would be that knight who is so magnanimous that he doesn't smite you.
It's like he's powerful, but he doesn't use his weapon on you, right?
Yes. Yeah, I don't need to kill you, but I could. Have a nice day.
The warrior in the garden, not the gardener in the war.
Yeah, very English, actually. Come back and become a country gentleman and put a cottage garden in. Yeah.
Suppress your PTSD and work in the field.
All right, so let's finish up. Basically, as I've been saying, the thing to think about here is like the comparison of whether to do it or not. As I think I'm probably the only person who's ever done a theology degree and chucked in rational choice theory. As weird as that might sound, I actually argued, if you've read the chapter, that it was a better option for Eve. What was the other option? If you don't really know and you don't have the knowledge, then it's worth giving it a try. If God has infinite knowledge and maybe this one bite will give you a part of that, then that probably is worth actually jumping in and trying. So even Pandora, they're really about moral lessons, something we forget these days. They're trying to teach us how to live a better life. Now, in our first early lesson of things, a moral lesson is like Aesop's tales going to be read one way, as in, no, little Johnny, don't do that. But as we get older, these moral tales change and the narratives become deeper. And as we start thinking about them, they have more nuanced interpretations, and we can look at them in a variety of different ways. So it is then coming into stories of predetermination, free will, divine design, human desire. And while many people, the Dawkings of this world, will try and tell you how little there is in the Bible, if you actually think deeply about these decisions and you analyze it fully, they go very deep into sort of, well, unsolved and probably unsolvable theological and philosophical questions.